My name is Makia Harper. How I got my first start into filmmaking, and I'll go way back in time with high school. I went to a creative and performing arts high school in Philadelphia. And there I majored in creative writing, and I took all sorts of creative writing classes like expository writing, journalistic writing, screenwriting. And I had a teacher that encouraged me to make my words visual. We also had a broadcast class, and he said, "Oh, Makia, you should really think about visualizing your words." And I was like, I don't know that that's really me. Video was not really my thing, but I remember my senior year, I had a project where I had to do a short documentary of my assistant principal. And secretly, I fell in love with documentary. So after that senior year, I went on to Temple University in Philadelphia, and I majored in film and media arts. And during that time, I was able to hone my skills in post-production and editing, some videography work. And there I did a number of just like short projects just to kind of get through college, quite honestly. And I really wasn't kind of thinking about putting together work for a portfolio or anything like that. I just kind of thought that my first film job would kind of like fall from the sky because I finished school and, I was interning and things like that. Certainly I realized that's not how it worked. So I worked probably for 6 or 7 years after graduating, taking all different sorts of jobs, some as a production assistant. I worked as assistant editor for a couple of ad agencies. I did some acting work any way that I could get into the field I was doing. But I knew at the time my passion really was in post. And there was this period where I wasn't working in the industry at all. And I took on this job as a secretary. And, I was already starting to feel a little kind of stifled by editing because I loved video editing, but I felt like I couldn't be creative. And I was talking to one of my old professors, and she says, "Well, Makia, why don't you make your own film?" And I was just like, I don't have the resources right now. I'm a secretary. Like, how is that going to happen? And so I was working at Drexel University in Philadelphia at that time, secretary, front desk, receptionist. And at the time, the rate of violence in Philadelphia was so high. And I'm like, what are we doing about this? Like, we need to be talking about why this is happening, and we need to be coming up with solutions. And so I knew so many people, including myself, being affected by, rates of gun violence. And at that point, I had this idea to do this film. And I said, okay, so I don't have the resources. I don't have a camera. I didn't have any editing equipment. And I'm like, okay, how do I do this? And I said, wait, Makia, you're at a university that teaches filmmaking. So what, you got your BA several years ago. It doesn't mean that you can't take a class while you're here, and they pay for it. So I signed up for a documentary production class so that I could do this film on reducing violence in Philadelphia. And so I was able to stay enrolled in this class. I took it incomplete, and I was able to stay enrolled because I didn't finish it. It was a summer course. And I completed my first feature-length documentary, which was called God Speaks: Philadelphia Voices Against Violence. So that first piece just kind of really just organically kind of came together. I honestly was really nervous about doing my own documentary, but once I got into the process, it was just really innate and natural. I've always kind of been a really strong producer, and I've always been able to really identify and see stories. So yeah, it just happened quite naturally after my old professor kind of encouraged me. I saw a need to deal with a social issue. So that was the first kind of project that I did on my own. Kind of consider myself a visual kind of activist, So for me, my love of the art form of filmmaking and storytelling kind of work in tandem with my desire for social justice, issues around reducing violence, gun violence, police brutality, the stories of people of color, particularly Black communities. Wellness are all issues that are very dear and really important to me. And I just find it so incredibly important to, talk about these issues and to talk to people that are kind of working to address some of these social issues, working to develop communities, and working towards healing. Oftentimes, there are individuals that are doing great work impacting their society, or they have absolutely amazing stories that are inspiring. And I really think that those stories are important. The impact that I think that my films have had on the communities that they've been based on, I think has largely been, quite positive, in that one of the things, or one of my hopes for my films, is that, they create discussion, right? And ultimately that discussion leads to action. People wanting to be involved in their communities, people wanting to come up with solutions to face a number of the issues that I kind of document in my work. So ultimately, it's about awareness, providing awareness. It's about creating conversation, which certainly my films do. My films kind of act as oftentimes a community organizing tool. So people actually kind of come together and, start talking and say, oh, I was really inspired by this. Are you doing any work here? Are you doing any work? What can we do? Because I want to keep this going. And so for me, that's so incredibly rewarding. And some of my work is really about understanding and also learning history, right? And to be informed. And there's just so much power in knowing, right? That's incredibly important for me. So just to also provide an education, because, I know it's a cliche to say knowledge is power. That is powerful. The idea that we can learn so much, we have so much from the knowledge. So that's, really what's important for me, that people are impacted in a positive way. As I mentioned earlier, my first film was called God Speaks: Philadelphia Voices Against Violence. The film is about individuals working to reduce gun violence in Philly. And so in that film, I highlight 4 activists really that are working to reduce violence in a variety of different ways. I had one person who was a fashion designer who worked with the Philadelphia Police Department to get the confiscated guns and the gunmetal and have it melted down and give it to her so that she could create jewelry from the gunmetal, which I thought that was a really interesting approach to kind of getting guns off the street. Then I had another individual who's actually my cousin. He took a bit more of a spiritual approach and really grassroots. So every week he would walk like 2 miles within his neighborhood and pray for every home. He would have a men's breakfast the first Sunday of the month, and he would fund it on his own. He worked with local daycare centers to just encourage education with, little people and young people. And so when the toddlers in daycare or preschool would graduate, he would have little awards for them and give them cash prizes. So he was just really involved at the grassroots level. He also brought a property in the area for a multi-space use, so community members could use that space and rent from him. So he was very much invested in developing his community in a very kind of grassroots way. I had another gentleman who commissioned a football and basketball team. He also had a radio show on addiction. He also worked in the Department of Mental Health, and his thing was really to reach as many people as possible. So he worked to reach the youth, giving them an outlet for extracurricular activities. He had this show about, addiction and recovery, giving folks resources. And himself, he worked in, the Office of Mental Health, all of these kind of, I don't want to say tangential, but all of these like adjacent areas that are related or can be related to violence. He wanted to provide resources to youth. He wanted to provide services that might be needed for those, dealing with addiction. And then the final person, he ran a center, he's no longer there, but he ran an after school program and special programs for men of color, things like chess on Saturdays and after school programs so they could, kind of just talk about things that they were dealing with in school, after school support, a really positive organization. So yeah, I highlighted the works of those 4 people, very different approaches to reducing violence. And that's why I thought it was quite interesting, because, my ultimate thesis was that, this is a multi kind of pronged approach to reducing violence. There isn't necessarily any one way, and there's so many different factors that are connected to gun violence. Several years later, I've done a number of short documentaries, but another community-oriented piece was called Our Space, Our Food, Our Bed-Stuy. And this film was rooted in the Bed-Stuy community in Brooklyn, and it highlighted the works of community gardens, gardeners, and urban farmers. And essentially, at that time, I didn't live in what's technically called a food desert, but certainly I didn't live close to healthy, affordable food. So I wanted to see what other community members were doing to kind of stem this issue. I love good food. I love healthy food and affordable food. So I talked to urban gardeners, community gardeners, and they said, we're growing food. We know that we can't feed an entire neighborhood, but what we can do is build community and unify and work towards, creating policy change. And so I also worked with this group called City Harvest, and City Harvest had a mobile markets program where they would offer fruits and vegetables the first Saturday of the month in the area, as well as some of the corner stores that were trying to provide healthy food options. And some of the issues that emerged, some of them were incredibly expensive. So what we looked at again was, kind of multiple ways to kind of stem this issue, right? And we really looked at what the issues were. How I go about my film work is really, I kind of look for the story, what I think about, what is the story? What's significant about this story? And I think about, why should I tell this story? What do I have to offer? What specifically can my perspective kind of give this film? So those are those kind of initial things that I start to think about. And, oftentimes I profile the work of people or the lives of people, and then I start to think about and look at who are, people doing the work, who are the people that have these stories that may not get told ever unless it's me. So I kind of look for that. I kind of look for it. Most of the times I will say it feels very organic. I feel in a lot of ways my projects kind of call me. I think that I kind of put something out in the universe. I kind of put this idea out of something that I would like to explore. And in many ways, I kind of feel like, these stories, these people kind of come to me. But certainly, I do ask those questions in the beginning. Why is it me to tell this story? Why? What do these individuals have to offer society, their communities?